Welcome to Luso History. Today, we will explore the relations between Portugal and Japan, current and historical diplomatic, cultural and commercial relations between Japan and Portugal. The history of relations between the two nations dates back to the mid-16th century, when Portuguese sailors first arrived in Japan in 1543, and diplomatic relations were officially restarted in the 19th century with the Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Commerce. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to meet the Japanese in the 16th century. The firearms they later introduced had a major impact on the unification of Japan, and the ensuing era of trade stimulated economic development. The Portuguese legacy in Japan includes, among other things, Nanban art and gastronomic heritage, e.g. tempura, or various sweet dishes such as konpeito or castella cakes from Nagasaki, but also linguistic heritage, which is reflected in several dozen words borrowed from Portuguese in the Japanese language, in geography, religion, and everyday culture, for example, bread. The Portuguese heritage in Japan is still present in the consciousness of Japanese society today. The arrival of the Portuguese in Japan in 1543 marked the beginning of a period of intense cultural, commercial, and technological exchanges between the West and the East. This initial contact had a profound impact on Japanese society, introducing new elements that influenced various aspects of the local culture and economy. The Portuguese arrived on the island of Tanegashima and were the first Europeans to establish direct contact with Japan. This meeting brought significant innovations to the Japanese, such as firearms, which were readily assimilated and adapted by the samurai and daimyo, the feudal lords. Furthermore, the Portuguese also introduced items such as tobacco, bread, and wine, as well as navigational knowledge and trading techniques. Another important impact was the introduction of Christianity. Jesuit missionaries, led by St. Francis Xavier from 1549 onwards, sought to convert the local population, influencing the religious beliefs of many Japanese, especially among the daimyo in regions where Christianity was tolerated or even encouraged. This religious contact also began a period of mass conversion that generated significant political and religious tensions in the following decades. Between 1543 and 1571, the Portuguese acted as essential intermediaries in trade between China and Japan, at a time when direct relations between these two countries were limited due to political tensions and trade restrictions. This period is known as the establishment of Nanban Trade, which consolidated an exchange network that included goods of great value and economic relevance. At the time, the Ming dynasty, which ruled China, maintained a restrictive policy regarding maritime trade, especially with Japan, due to piracy and conflicts with Japanese privateers, Waco. As a result, Japan has had little direct interaction with China. This opened up an opportunity for the Portuguese, who quickly realized the potential of acting as intermediaries and established themselves on a profitable exchange route. The Portuguese established a route that linked Macau, in southern China, to the Japanese port of Nagasaki. They transported Chinese products, such as silk, porcelain, fans, and other luxury goods, and sold them in Japan, where these items were highly valued. In return, we acquired precious metals from Japan, especially silver, which were highly prized in China due to their scarcity in the domestic market. This trading system worked to the advantage of all parties. For Japan, access to Chinese goods that did not come directly was allowed. For China, Chinese products reached the Japanese market without the need for direct diplomatic relations with Japan. For Portugal, Sino-Japanese trade brought enormous profits to Portuguese traders, strengthening Portugal's economic position in Asian trade. The ports of Nagasaki and Macau became strategic points for this intermediated trade. In Nagasaki, The Portuguese received permission to establish a permanent commercial base, which established the city as a center of international trade. Likewise, Macau served as an entry point for Japanese products and a redistribution point for Chinese goods. This intermediate trade contributed to the economic development of the regions involved and expanded cultural and technological exchange between Japan and China. The flow of goods generated not only wealth, but also an exchange of ideas and customs, influencing cultural and artistic aspects in both regions. This period, which preceded Japan's closure to foreign trade in the 17th century, was essential for the flourishing of Asian-European relations in the era of great navigation. The introduction of firearms by the Portuguese in Japan in 1543 had a profound and transformative impact, especially during the Sengoku period, 1467 to 1615, an era marked by intense internal conflicts between daimyo, feudal lords, competing for power. This period of civil wars saw the arrival of the Portuguese and their firearms, mainly the arquebuses, which quickly influenced the dynamics of battles and the Japanese military system itself. The first arquebuses were introduced on the island of Tanegashima, where the Portuguese accidentally landed in 1543. These weapons aroused great interest among local leaders, who recognized their military potential. The Japanese began to copy and adapt the design of Portuguese arquebuses, starting large-scale local production. The skill of Japanese artisans soon led to firearms being integrated into the military forces, starting to play a central role in the conflicts of the period. Before the introduction of firearms, warfare in Japan was dominated by hand-to-hand fighting and the use of swords, such as the katana, and bows. The arrival of arquebuses changed this scenario, as they allowed ranged attacks with greater lethality. The need to adapt to new war technologies forced commanders to review their strategies. Row training. Inspired by Western military strategies, Japanese generals began using row training to maximize the impact of the arquebuses. The famous three-row formation allowed continuous firing, with alternating ranks firing while the others reloaded. Fortifications and defense. Japanese fortresses began to be built with new defenses against firearms, such as stone walls and structures designed to reduce the effectiveness of shots. Firearms were decisive in several battles of the Sengoku period. Notably, the Battle of Nagashino in 1575 was a landmark in Japan's military history. The strategic use of some 3,000 arquebuses by Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu helped them defeat the army of Takeda Katsuyori, known for the power of its cavalry. This triumph highlighted the superiority of firearms and solidified the prestige of Nobunaga, who would become one of the most powerful figures of the time. Impressed by the power of arquebuses, the Japanese developed a large-scale manufacturing process. In just a few years, Japan became one of the largest firearms producers in the world, with weapons of higher quality than European ones, adapted for the Japanese context. The dissemination of arquebuses was so wide that practically all daimyo began to include firearms in their forces, changing the balance of power and strengthening armies that previously had fewer advantages in combat. In addition to transforming the battlefield, firearms affected Japan's social and political structure. The dependence on technology that could be mass-produced and distributed allowed daimyo with fewer warriors to have a better chance of victory, altering the regional balance of power. With this, certain leaders managed to consolidate their dominance and expand their lands, creating the foundations for the future unification of Japan. Although firearms were instrumental during the Sengoku period, their use declined after the unification of Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate in the early 17th century. In an attempt to consolidate peace and social control, the new government restricted access to these weapons, valuing the return to traditional military practices such as the use of the sword by samurai. The arrival of the Portuguese Jesuits in Japan brought a series of cultural, religious, and intellectual changes that profoundly influenced Japanese society. The activities of the Jesuits, in particular, had a lasting impact on the spread of Christianity and the introduction of Western scientific and cultural knowledge. These missionaries were the first to establish a bridge between Christianity and Japan, also contributing to the exchange of ideas and values between the two cultures. The first Jesuit missionaries arrived in Japan in 1549, led by St. Francis Xavier. With the support of the Portuguese and some daimyo, the Jesuits began intense evangelization work. Despite great cultural and religious resistance, the Jesuits found a relatively open reception among some local leaders, who saw the alliance with the missionaries as an opportunity to strengthen their political and commercial positions. The Jesuits used a strategy of gradual conversion and respect for local traditions, seeking to adapt Christianity to the Japanese context. Churches were built, and Christian communities began to form, especially in regions where the daimyo supported the new religion. Within a few years, thousands of Japanese, including members of the nobility, were baptized, making Japan one of the main centers of Jesuit missions in Asia. In addition to their religious mission, the Jesuits contributed to the introduction of diverse Western knowledge in Japan, which had an impact on the arts, music, sciences, and technology. Arts and architecture. The Jesuits helped to spread European artistic techniques, such as oil painting, which was well received and adapted by Japanese artists, giving rise to the Nanban style, or Nanban, which means Southern Barbarian, as the Japanese called foreigners. This style fused Western aesthetic elements with Japanese artistic tradition. Also in architecture, the influence of the Jesuits is notable, with the construction of churches and chapels in European style, which introduced new concepts of design and structure. Music Jesuit missionaries introduced sacred music and Western musical instruments, such as the organ and harpsichord, which was great news for the Japanese. European melodies and religious songs were integrated into the lives of Christian communities, and some of these influences persisted in Japanese musical culture even after Japan's closure to the West. Western musical practice also influenced the way the Japanese composed and appreciated music, creating a new cultural dimension. Science and technology. The Jesuits also disseminated knowledge in areas such as astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and engineering. They introduced detailed maps, globes, and European scientific instruments such as astrolabes and telescopes, which made a great impact among the Japanese intellectual elite. The accuracy of the maps and the wealth of geographic information provided by the Jesuits impressed local scholars, who began to integrate this knowledge into geographic studies of Japan. In the field of medicine, the Jesuits taught Western treatment methods and medical techniques. This exchange helped diversify traditional Japanese methods, providing new insight into healing practices and health care. Despite its initial success, the Jesuit mission faced increasing opposition from Japanese leaders, especially as the Tokugawa shogunate consolidated its power in the early 17th century. Christianity came to be seen as a threat to social cohesion and the authority of rulers. In response, Japanese authorities began to crack down on Christians and ban the practice of religion. In 1614, Christianity was officially banned in Japan, leading to severe persecution against Christians and missionaries. From that moment on, the Jesuits began to operate clandestinely until they were completely expelled, marking the beginning of a policy of isolation that limited contact with the West for more than 2 centuries. The Nanban trade between Portugal and Japan left a lasting legacy on Japanese culture and society. This contact brought products such as tobacco, bread, and wine to Japan, as well as aesthetic influences that mixed with local art, creating the Nanban style in paintings and decorative arts. Technological innovations, such as arquebuses, transformed the military organization, strengthening leaders such as Oda Nobunaga. There were also advances in shipbuilding and the use of European navigational instruments, although these were restricted after Japanese isolation. Religiously, Christianity introduced by the Jesuits influenced Japanese spirituality, especially in Kyushu, where clandestine communities of Kakure Kirishitan preserved the faith even after persecution. For Japan, contact with the Portuguese was a gateway to the West and to cultural and technological advances. As for Portugal, trade brought wealth and strengthened its Asian empire.